Good evening and welcome to tonight's webinar. We're going to be listening to a talk by Chris Pickford, which we're very much looking forward to. Before we get started, we'll go through the sort of normal bits of housekeeping, which are just to say that it's only going to be the microphones and video cameras on mine and Chris's computers that are active, so feel free to get around, move around, and you won't be disturbing the proceedings in the slightest, so do make yourself comfortable. If you're joining us via Zoom, then please do use the chat and Q&A facilities. Please do use the Q&A for questions though, and we'll come to those at the end. You should find them at the bottom of the interface, and you might need to press 3 little dots to get access to them if you're on a mobile device. If you're joining us on YouTube, you're very welcome, but unfortunately there's no facility for interaction during the presentation if you're joining us from there. I noticed that we already have a question in from the rectory at St Neots, so very good evening there. One of the big questions is, why are you showing a picture of Great St Mary's? Well, I'm very sorry, that's just what I happen to have to hand, and has been the intro to all of the webinars, the sequence. So without much further ado, I'd like to introduce Chris. So I'll ask him to appear on screen as if by magic. And hopefully whilst we're waiting for that to happen, it's worthwhile introducing him. So Chris is a professional archivist, and we're very fortunate to have him along this evening to talk about the St Neots Foundry, and I think I'm sure Chris could do a fantastic job of introducing himself, but obviously being a past master of the College Youths, and also part of the archive team at Taylor's, and having had a professional career in archive material, we're very fortunate to have him to talk to us tonight. Anything else I should say before we get started, Chris?
No, I don't think so. I'll just say a few words of introduction myself and I'll get started. So
excellent, good. Well, so the thing I forgot to mention was Chris is expected to speak to it for about an hour, but we'll be very pleased to take questions at the end. Wonderful. Over to you, Chris.
Okay, well, good evening, everybody. I'm going to talk tonight about the St Neots Foundry, which operated for about 90 years between 1733 and 1820. This is actually a talk that I first gave back in 1988 to the St Neots Local History Society. I can actually remember the occasion in a room in St Neots, and that was a mixture of a fairly small number of slides and some overhead projection foils, a bit of a juggling act to get them together. So this has been adapted for Zoom, slightly updated, and I've particularly tried to drop in more material relating to the Ely Guild area. My research actually goes back to the time when I was a student in Leicester back in the early 70s, when I started doing newspaper researches for Cyril Ratton. That project ended up as being his Order and Disorder publication by the Central Council of newspaper references right back through for ringing right back to 1700. Fascinating stuff, and even at that time I got very interested in Edward Arnold, the heirs, and all the history to do with it. So what I'm giving you tonight is something that goes back a very long way, but it's been good to revisit it and to slightly bring it up to date. The presentation does include quite a lot of stuff that's well west of you, Leicester and Kettering, but it's so integral to the story I couldn't reduce it very much. So if you think at the time I'm actually going off stream, there are reasons why almost everything is included. I'm going to be taking the story roughly from 1714 at Kettering through to Taylor's emergence at Loughborough in 1840, sort of thinner at both ends of that, if you like. There's lots of detail. Lots of that detail is on the screen, partly because it's my own screen prompts. I need them to be able to remember what I'm supposed to be telling you. But it's also for people who watch it later, who might like to have some of the stuff actually written down and to be able to follow up with the pause button on some of the specific points. I think something I want to say right at the beginning is this isn't just about bells by any means. One of the things about the St Neots foundry that's really striking, compared to a lot of the other firms that I've explored, is the extent to which they're involved in a whole host of other manufacturing activities. And they're certainly going to feature in this talk as we go through. So if we move on to the first slide, why doesn't it want to go? There we go. So we're talking about the Eyre family of Kettering and St Neots. There's a family tree here, and in fact, a surprisingly good one, from Patrick King's 1952 article in the magazine Northamptonshire Past and Present. The thing about the Eyres is that they were actually a Quaker family. Several of them did get baptized in the Church of England, but they were substantially Quakers most of the way through the period we're talking about. And that means the records are different. And it's fortunate that some of the Kettering Quaker records have survived, and it enabled Patrick, who I used to know professionally, to put together this pedigree. What's important, I think, is that actually I've jumped a slide. I did want to just say by saying that tailors have very proud links to the past, and in fact, if I can go up, I'll go back to it. Yeah. One of the things about their publicity is they very often say that they're successors to Watts, Eyre and Arnold of Leicester and St Neots. And that's something that comes through all the way through this, that the Watts and Eyre connection as Taylor's antecedents is very important. Now, the bell founding members of the family started with Thomas. The numbering on Patrick's pedigree is different to how bell people tend to describe them. So in terms of the pedigree, we're looking at someone called Thomas Eyre II, but to bell people, he's thought of as Thomas Eyre I. Now, he was active. He was born in 1691 and died in 1758. And with his brothers, they were all involved at the start of the bell founding activity. John, who died quite young, 1718, brother George, who died in 1749, and Joseph, who is really the person at St Neots, died in 1772. Thomas's son, Thomas Eyre the second, third on the pedigree, took over in 1758 and died and went bankrupt in 1762. So he's part of the story too. Now, the start of bell founding goes back to Thomas Eyre I, who was already an established clockmaker and in his 20s at Kettering, when the parish contracted to have the old 5 bells recast as a ring of 8. The founder they chose was a slightly strange choice. It was Richard Sanders of Bromsgrove in Worcestershire, near here. Sanders bells are quite common near here, and he also did a lot of work in Cheshire, but these are the only Sanders bells over in Northamptonshire. He cast a brand new complete ring of 8 with a 2400 weight tenor. Now, Thomas Eyre signed the vesture minutes to agree that the project should go ahead, and the name of T. Eyre Horrow, in other words, clockmaker, is actually inscribed on one of the 1714 bells. So the Eyres were actually involved in the casting of the new 8 there. Thomas Eyre himself was to go on to recast the tenor in 1718, quite a big commission for someone just starting out in bell founding, and the 7th in 1722. There are a number of Eyre bells cast 1717 to 1718, and there's a list of them there. But the earliest surviving one is at Yeldon in North Bedfordshire, which was cast by Thomas Eyre and his younger brother John, in 1717. This is a rather attractive bell with these clockmakers' marks around the date. They're spandrel marks from a long-cased clock. And the initials of the founders are between the cannons on the crown of the bell. Really quite an unusual thing. The earliest rings by the Eyres were the 5s. It was a 5 at Lubbenham in Leicestershire near Market Harborough, and a 6 at Hemmingford Gray in Old Huntingdonshire. It both cast in 1724. By the way, I shall be using old counties throughout. There's a historical reason why that makes sense when you're researching bells, and in fact, indeed, doing a lot of historical research. And also, I'll be talking about what was originally provided rather than what's there now. In fact, in both cases, there are substantial Eyre bells left at those 2 towers, but not at Kettering. Now, what soon becomes clear when you start looking at Thomas Eyre is he was a polymath. He did all sorts of things. He was a clockmaker, a bell founder, an architect, a draftsman, a map maker. He actually made the first county map of Northamptonshire, an artist, an archaeologist, an inventor, and so on and so on. So he's a really multi-talented man. As far as bells were concerned, we see very early on that Eyre modelled his bells on those by Watts of Leicester. There's a lovely quote written by the Reverend William Ludlam in 1780, and we'll be seeing more of Ludlam. Mr. Eyre had crooks or forms cut on thin boards, carefully taken from inside and outside of all the good bells he could find. This county, Leicestershire and Northamptonshire, abounds of the best bells I ever heard, by Hugh Watts of Leicester, cast between 1630 and 1650. Watts' bells can be very, very good indeed, even thought highly of today. And you can see from the two on the left that Thomas Eyre has moulded his very high domed bell at Curdworth on one cast by Hugh Watts in 1615. The shape and profile and so on is completely identical. In the records at Loughborough, we have some definite information of this. This is the record for the bells at Fulbourn, cast in 1776 by Arnold, but the same page also mentions that in 1755, Joseph Eyre had copied a bell for Sawston in South Cambridgeshire on a 17th century bell at Wilden. And there on the right is the Watts bell at Wilden, still there. So we've got definite evidence that that happened. And also there's a mention of the other 5 bells at Quorndon, copied from Watts at different times. So a nice bit of documentary proof there that what Ludlam says is true. To get back to Thomas Eyre as a polymath, well, he made long case and turret clocks. There's a couple of church clocks. One of them is at Stoke Doyle, where there's a picture on the right. There's a nice one on the left, signed by Thomas Eyre of Kettering. He was a model maker, and he made a design of this Gothic bridge at Boughton Park in Northamptonshire, 1744. He produced a printed map of Kettering in 1719, and as I say, went on to produce several other maps of very high quality and accuracy. And at Stoke Doyle, he was actually the architect of the church. At the record office in Shrewsbury, don't ask why they're there, there are the plans for this church and a lot of correspondence about the building of it. Thomas Eyre was also very well connected. Because of his artwork and his map making, he did a lot of the drawings for John Bridges' History of Northamptonshire. Bridges died without publishing it, but he got all the materials ready. This drawing is in fact by Tielmans, the architect, not by Eyre, but in the same collection are quite a number of them done by Eyre. Another of his contacts and friends was William Ludlam, who became rector of King's Norton and Galby, we'll come to in a short while. But he was also a mathematics professor at Cambridge, a noted mechanic, an astronomer, a musician, and he was one of the referees for the chronometer and John Harrison's marine chronometer. So he's a very highly connected and intelligent man. The other is William Stukeley, who was well known as an antiquarian archaeologist, a physician, and again a clergyman. He came from Stamford, and there was part of a circle that all these people were connected with. Eyre also had a number of gentry clients, not just for bell founding, but also his clocks and for his instruments that he made. A couple of examples in Northamptonshire at Dean Park, the seat of the Earl of Cardigan, Drayton House, the Germain family, later the Sackville Stopford Sackvilles, and at Boughton House that I haven't shown, where that model was made for. But a particularly interesting one is Harrowden Hall in Northamptonshire, because there Eyre made a small chime of 12 bells, actually 13, with a mechanical chiming machine, and it was sadly destroyed by fire in 1790. But you'll see that a newspaper report referred to it, that the chimes had consisted of 12 bells, allowed to have been the most masterly and ingenious piece of mechanism in this county. Rather a nice quote, and in the tailor's records again, there are quite a lot of details of the bells. There's details of the bells there on the left, and they're all hemispherical bells, dish bells. No other founders in the UK were making dish bells at that time. And there's also some drawings of the chiming machine and how it worked, and a description of it, and a note that it was destroyed about 1793 to 4. Perhaps the most interesting from the point of view of ringers is the circle involving William Fortrey at Kings Norton and Golby in Leicestershire. This is one of the most brilliant microcosms of the aristocratic gentry patronage of ringing in the 18th century. Fortrey was incredibly wealthy. He died in 1783 at the age of 85, and there's his tombstone at the monument at the east end of Kings Norton Church on the right. He was the squire of these villages and owned a lot of other property, but he was also passionate about ringing. He supported ringing in very many ways, and he rebuilt two of the churches on his patch. Golby was the slightly earlier one, a remarkable building with that 18th century tower with chinoiserie in the pinnacles and detailing. And Kings Norton, which is an amazing early Gothic revival building, correctness of Gothic, slightly fanciful 18th century Gothic, by the local architect John Wing, who was involved in both of those. Now, I stress the names because Ludlam, Wing and Fortrey were all involved in many things that involved the heirs. At Golby, Thomas Eyre provided a ring of 6 in 1000 weight in 1740-41. Kings Norton ended up with not just a ring of 8 that I've got here, but also a ring of 10. They were subsequently augmented and then de-augmented. But these were Eyre jobs. Eyre was a friend of William Fortrey and William Ludlam, and it was obviously a natural person to cast the bells. Thomas Eyre I didn't end up casting the bells at Kings Norton, though he must have been involved in the project at an earlier stage. Thomas II was involved when the tower was completed, but he went bankrupt and Joseph finished it. We'll return to the Kings Norton Tower later. Another landed family that was very interested in bells and was involved with the same group of people was the Palmer family of Carlton. The Palmers had taken ownership of Carlton Curlew Hall in Leicestershire in 1664. This village is also known as West Carlton because the Palmers owned East Carlton in Northamptonshire too. The Palmers had the tower top rebuilt at Carlton Curlew in 1685, and 3 bells there were cast by Eyre in 1732, still on their original fittings, incidentally. The church was rebuilt, a brick with Gothic windows, by John Wing in 1767. But rather more interesting is East Carlton. Here, Joseph Eyre had provided a ring of 6 in 1755, and the frame and fittings are by Eyre or by Arnold, because the church was rebuilt in 1788. John Wing was the architect, and either the fittings were as Eyre's originals of 1755, or Arnold rehung them about the time the church was finished and the clock was put in. The clock there, now electrically wound, of course, so you can't see it to its best, or at least that's how it looked in 1973, is by Arnold, 1789. So you've got all these people involved, and you've got Wing, Ludlam, Fortrey, and the heirs, and later Arnold. And Arnold and Joseph Eyre continued with the contacts that had been built up by Thomas Eyre. To look at him as a bell founder and bell hanger, well, Thomas Eyre was incredibly competent. I mean, he produced very well cast bells. He remodeled the ring of 8 into 10 at St Margaret's, Leicester in 1738, and those are the old trebles before they were recast. And they were reckoned to be an extremely good old style ring. He was a competent frame maker and bell hanger. There's a frame of his at Manchester in Warwickshire, dated 1751. And we know it's by Eyre because there's his signed receipt on the right. That writing I would recognise if I was looking through a bundle of papers at any time. I've seen a lot of Thomas Eyre's letters, bills, and so on, and that writing is very, very distinctive. I need to say a little bit about Brother George, because Brother George was a ringer. We don't know that that Thomas I was. Interesting, there was a fantastic rivalry between Kettering and Leicester in 1729-31 about peal ringing. It was about who could ring the heaviest bells, who could ring them the fastest, and so on. And the two towers competed. At Kettering, there were a couple of, it's again one of the great ringing stories of that period. But at Kettering, they rang at least 2 peals, and there is still a painted board in the tower recording them. And you'll see that George Eyre rang the 4th to both those peals. In the first one, in 1729, Henry Lads rang the tenor, and he certainly was involved at Stoke Doyle as a carpenter and as probably the frame builder there. There's an interesting reference at Stamford All Saints in 1726 when Thomas Eyre cast a bell, because there's a payment to John Smith for a horse to carry Mr. Eyre's brother home, he being lamed by a bell. I don't know, of course, whether this was George, as I suspect it was, or Joseph, because at that stage Joseph was still working for the Kettering firm. George also made a fire engine for Rockingham Castle, and he was a clockmaker. There's a couple of clocks made by him. There's one at Titchmarsh, that lovely 8, just on the west side of Northamptonshire, and just up the road at Brigstock, both of 1745. And I think the clock at Notting in Bedfordshire is probably also by George Eyre, because it's identical. Same finials, same layout of trains and so on. So coming to the key statistics about the Eyres, well, between them, they cast about 500 bells. The majority of those were cast by Joseph, 253, Thomas I, 202, and a couple of the early partnership ones and later ones there. In terms of rings of bells, they cast 36 rings of bells in all. That includes a 3 and a 4, but you can see from the breakdown below, there's 5 8s, 12 6s, 17 5s. They were all, the sort of maximum that people were having mainly in the 18th century. They also supplied between them 16 counties, and there's at least some survivors in most of those areas. The most important jobs by Thomas Eyre I were the 1700 weight 8 at Daventry, put into the new church there when that was newly built, and a 3000 weight 8 at Grantham, cast in 1752, subsequently made up to 10, and of course eventually recast. A quick timeline of the Eyres. Thomas Eyre then began bell founding in 1717, alongside already a lot of other activities. Joseph Eyre, then aged about 26, separated from his brother and moved to St Neots in 1733. And from then on, they were actually separate businesses until after the bankruptcy of Thomas II in 1762. Thomas I died in 1758, and the business passed to his son. Joseph Eyre then carried on at St Neots until 1772, when he was succeeded by Edward Arnold, who's said to have been his cousin, but I have seen no proof of that family relationship. But the two advertisements down the bottom concern Thomas Eyre II's bankruptcy. In an assignment, Thomas Eyre had made over his effects, debts and credits to Joseph Eyre. And on the left-hand side, the bell founding businesses, the shops, will be carried on by Joseph Eyre and Company of St Neots. The clockmaking side at Kettering carried on under John Bates, who is the son-in-law of Thomas I, Thomas's sister. Happy families? Well, I suspect not. There's another Ludlam letter. There's about 6 letters from Ludlam, and they're so insightful and quite racy. After the decease of Thomas Eyre, his son became bankrupt. The uncle Joseph, whom Thomas could never abide, got possession of the molds and so on. But Joseph, by this stage, had got a bad character for sodomatical practices, and was prosecuted, committed and sentenced, and therefore, was under a bit of a cloud, as it were. The constant ill fame he was under, the bad company he kept, and many collateral stories never cleared up, made every charge believed. This ruined him in terms of his reputation, and he died soon after. Both Thomases by that stage were dead when his sexual proclivities, shall we say, came out. One Arnold who had worked with Joseph Eyre took over, and he says, Arnold, I believe, is a much better founder than the Whitechapel founders, but though by no means equal to old Thomas Eyre. There's another glimpse of what might have happened in something I shall show you in a moment. A quick biography of Joseph Eyre then. Born 1707, died 1772, he was the younger brother of Thomas, and he also was a multi-talented entrepreneur. He appears at various times as bell founder, clockmaker, whitesmith, mechanic, and so on. And he moved to St Neots in about 1733, and married Sarah Soane in 1736. She died before him. They had no children, perhaps not surprising given what I've already said. He was a friend of William Stukely, and Stukely's diaries record at least 10 meetings with Joseph, 1741 to 52. Eyre was an artist as well. There's a view of Buntisham Church of 1738 at the British Library. He dabbled in architecture, a couple of examples there. And in 1752, like John Harrison, he was working on a marine chronometer, a spring clock with horizontal wheels that would go half a year, and to cope with the conditions of the West Indies, of the Indies rather. He's known to have attempted to make a chaise to go without horses. Just imagine Joseph Eyre as the inventor of the motor car. He was a ringer, and he joined the College Youths in 1763. We'll see a bit more of his ringing in a minute. He had several apprentices, the three names here, but the two I need to mention are Edward Arnold, because he was successor, but Islip Edmonds, whose name we'll come back to. In his death notice in 1772, he was described as a very ingenious mechanic, and the will includes goods and effects, some bequests to his Kettering nieces, totaling almost £2,000, plus his property. So he died a very wealthy man, even if he was in shame. He endowed a charity for a Christmas distribution at St Neots at Christmas, and that charity is still going. And like most people of any substance, he served various times as parish officer at St Neots. Now, we know that he arrived in St Neots in 1733 because he worked on the Melchbourne Church clock. This clock here was reconstructed by Ken Shrimpton in the 1980s from bits and pieces found under the staircase in the tower. But it's also documented in the church warden's accounts, you can see in the middle. And there are payments to Mr. Eyre for work on the clock and for fetching the clock from St Ede's. In other words, Eyre was by then already working at St Neots. Eton Soken clock was also made by Eyre in 1733, and that was a new clock which he guaranteed for 10 years. One of the interesting things about the Melchbourne clock is it's actually a 17th century gate frame clock, but it has the attachment at the front. You can see if I just point my cursor, which was where it was converted from a foliot escapement to a deadbeat. Eyre's first bells in St Neots were 1735 for Chatteris, a ring of 5 of about 700 weight. The tenor there is an addition. Now, what about his foundry? It's fortunate that we know quite a lot about his foundry, not least because there's a map of 1757 that shows it, with in the middle a little sketch of it. Rather odd looking building, and you can see on the left the present Oast House, or as it's known, in the Priory Maltings. The Priory was an estate right bounded on the river. Again, if I just move my cursor, the River Ouse is here. Here's the marketplace, and the church is down here somewhere. So you know exactly where it is if you know St Neots. This strange building may well have been the foundry. Joseph bought the Priory land in a sale in 1751. The Priory house went to somebody else, but he bought the riverside land there. And he must have built this conical building before 1757. It's not mentioned in his will, but then he might have already handed it on to Arnold or previously sold it. But Arnold was certainly renting it or had possession of it in 1780. The area was subsequently developed as a brewery, which is why it's known as the Priory Maltings. But Fowler, the brewer, bought it from John Fox in 1789. That may have been because Arnold went bankrupt in 1779 to 80, and a lot of his property had to be sold. Nevertheless, it was still in the occupation of Robert Taylor, and also listed as a foundry in 1814, when the entire brewery estate was put up for sale. Ranald Clouston, the Bell historian, Paul Taylor from Loughborough, and Ray Ayres, who was later, of course, involved with Eyre and Smith and with Loughborough, visited in 1974, and from close inspection, they believed it to be the Eyre Foundry building, and not, as has often been claimed, a building rebuilt as a malting. Slightly strange building for a foundry, perhaps, though glass cones and pottery kilns are the same sort of shape. But there is a sketch plan in the Taylor archive, which possibly shows this building used as a foundry. As a bell founder, Joseph Eyre's bells are very, very competent. Traditional 18th century bell, standard shape. There's one at Shelton on the left. You can see Joseph Eyre's name on it. He cast a lot of his bells with very finely decorated cannons. The ones at Kings Norton were cut off in the 1980s, 1970s, but they're still on the bell at Felmersham at the bottom. When I was a student in Leicester, Kings Norton bells are still on their early frame and fittings. The frame original, many of the fittings original too, probably by Joseph Eyre, 1764. We rang a peal on them, and it was certainly very, very hard work. But fascinating that those fittings survived, not least because you can see, those of you who know about bell fittings will see that the gudgeons are of the continuous or hoop gudgeon type, with the hoop round the cannons. And that was an invention of the Eyres, which reduced made sure that the gudgeons stayed in good alignment rather than sagging as they did with other types. Now, as I said, Joseph Eyre was a ringer, and one of his main commissions was the bells at St Neots Church in 1753. Believe it or not, that massive tower, completed in the 1530s, early 16th century, had only had a 10 hundredweight 6 until Joseph Eyre moved to St Neots. And there are newspaper advertisements and reports for the opening of the new peal of 8 cast by Joseph Eyre in 1753. The college youths came up from London and rang several good peals of Grancer trebles and Bob Major, and all the judges present expressed their satisfaction that they were as tunable and tonable as any bells in England. Now, really interestingly, on the right-hand side is a small section from John Holt's broadsheet with his compositions for Grancer triples, and along the side of it, there's a list of subscribers. Now, among them are the Cambridge Company, those Cambridge youths, William Fortree of Kings Norton, and the St Neots Company. So the St Neots Company, newly formed, Holt probably sold them one when he knew he was coming up for the opening at St Neots, sold them a copy of the broadsheet, and in 1756, the St Neots ringers rang Holt's complete peal of 5,040 Grancer triples in 3 hours and 40 minutes. So you've got a 10 hundredweight 6 turning into an 8 and developing a competent change ringing band very soon afterwards. Rather nice little microcosm. Whether Joseph Eyre was in the band, we do not know, because there's no record of the band. Eyre, like Thomas before him, was a competent and very able maker of turret clocks and other sorts of clocks. There are several church clocks made by Joseph Eyre in existence or documented. Nice one there at the top. The escapement's altered, but it's still there. It's still Joseph Eyre's clock of 1764 at Swithland in Leicestershire. For the 8 bells at Kings Norton in 1765, Joseph Eyre provided a clock, which you see here before it was restored in the 70s, and also a chiming machine of the sort that you can see in the centre at Hemel Hempstead. The Hemel Hempstead chimes are signed by Joseph Eyre, St Neots, 1761 on the frame, and is still in operation, or were when I went there in the 80s. There was a similar machine at Newport Pagnell, and that had a brass plate on one of the corner posts, like another one I shall show you shortly, which has the list of the tunes on and says at the bottom, Joseph Eyre made me 1762. The late Ranald Clouston had a Joseph Eyre long case clock, shown here, and there's also a couple of lost watch advertisements that tell us that Joseph made or certainly retailed and put his name on watches as well. But he was more than just that, because he was a noted inventor and mechanic. This advertisement on the left of the Northampton Mercury of 1780 refers to several goods for sale that had been made by Thomas Eyre Senior. And he'd made fire engines, steel yards for weighing heavy loads, a perambulator, in other words, his map-making instrument for measuring distances along the roads, used in the surveying the county of Northampton. Rather a nice insight as to some of the goods that he'd made and owned. Joseph Eyre made a fire engine. He offered to make one for the parish of St Neots in 1758 for a price of £40. And interestingly, he was going to make it in the form of Mr. Nuttall's with the best materials, similar to those that Nuttall had supplied already, because the parish had 3 fire engines. Now, this is really interesting because what Air's doing here is he is copying the fire engine that Nuttall had made. Adam Nuttall, Longacre, was engine maker to the Royal Navy and a noted maker of fire engines. A number of examples survive. A quick bit of Googling, I found this one in Salisbury Museum, there's one at Plimpton in Devon, and one somewhere else down in Cornwall, Lostwithiel maybe. These engines for extinguishing fires play with a constant stream of prodigious force, a large bore of water, and thereby sooner extinguish the flames in buildings than any engines hitherto contrived. So Air was quite keen to get on that bandwagon, and his mechanical skills enabled him to make one. But Joseph's particular claim to distinction is the inventor of the platform weighbridge. On the left is a rare survival, and it's still there, overhanging the street, of the old form of weighing engine at the Bell Inn at Woodbridge in Suffolk. This sort of thing involved actually hitching the wagon up onto chains, lifting the whole thing up, weighing it, and then letting it down again and shackling it back up to the horse again. The weighbridge that Air had developed was illustrated in the Gentleman's Magazine in 1748 in an article written by Thomas Yeoman and claiming the invention for Mr. Wyatt of Birmingham. There's a very detailed description and an actual drawing of the platform weighbridge. It took Air a while to catch up with this, but in 1751 he refuted Yeoman and Wyatt's claims in the Gents Mag and put his own claim on it, saying that he'd been employed in making almost all the weighing engines within 50 miles of London, a claim which was supported by various experts who agreed that he should have the credit of the invention. So this was a really significant thing, and weighing engines were part of the St Neots output right the way through. As a result of these inventions, as a result of his commercial success, particularly with weighbridges, I'm sure, he became a substantial man of property. He owned a couple of cottages in Ford End at Eton Soken from 1738. He bought two at the same time, so he'd obviously already got a fair bit of money. In 1748, he bought the old George Inn in St Neots. It's now the department store on the corner of Huntingdon Street, rebuilt it and erected what's there now, which included the town assembly rooms on the upper floors, complete with a domed ceiling and a musician's gallery, apparently. So quite a splendid building, and not a cheap undertaking to build. In his will, he mentions various properties in St Neots, Amesbury, and also in Eton Soken. And he left those to be dealt with by his trustees. And there are documents, deeds relating to the sale of some of them. As already said, the priory, the foundry, is not mentioned specifically in the will, so perhaps he'd handed it on already. And Air himself lived at a house in St Neots in Huntingdon Street, actually just behind the George, which was demolished in 1960. And this actually had his initials, JE 1754, on one of the upper window surrounds. Now, he dabbled as an architect. Whether he actually did his own housework or anything, I don't know. But the most important thing that he did was design a new tower for St Michael's in Stamford, which had only previously had a wooden tower. St Michael's had a new tower, you can see on the Stamford skyline there, built in 1762, and a ring of six. The church there was rebuilt in the 1830s and closed in 1974, but the Air bells have been since moved to Knighton near Leicester, and the back six of a peal of 8. I think that St Michael's Tower, the Victorian one, when I went up there in the early 70s, was probably the filthiest and most horrible belfry I'd ever been in for pigeons. Actually squidgy as well as deep. It was just ghastly. And whoever got the bells out and moved them had to rescue them from that state. Another example, and the details are in Owen's Church Bells of Huntingdonshire, is at Warboys. Quite a nicely documented case where we've got the churchwarden's accounts for as well as the 5 bells still surviving. Very typical Air inscriptions, and that represents the lettering that he used. But the accounts tell us about the costs, the new metal, and tell us that Ayr also provided the frame and the fittings. The frame cost £25, the fittings £20, which means roughly £4 per bell, and a new clock, an 8-day clock and a dial plate. The clock, I believe, is gone, but the bells are there as the back 5 of the present 6. Interestingly, at Whittlesea in 1758-9, Ayr didn't just provide one peal of bells, he provided 2 complete new sets of bells. At St Mary's, the 5 old bells were run into 6 with additional metal near a ton. So the old bells were increased in number and substantially increased in weight. They were subsequently turned into an 8. At St Andrews, it's slightly confusing, and I would still need to know a bit more about exactly what happened there. But according to the records printed in Ravens, Cambridgeshire, Ayr only provided 5 bells in 1759 with a 1300 weight tenor. But certainly later on, they became a 1900 weight 6, and they were 1900 weight 6 by the 1840s. I find it hard to believe that a tenor was added, and I think that possibly the records are not quite don't relate to what's there now. A very unusual case then of 2 peals of bells being cast for one town within just a couple of years, within 2 years. There is a similar case not far away at King's Lynn, where Leicester and Pack of Whitechapel provided 2 brand new sets of bells in 1766. A 1600 weight 8 at St Nicholas, since recast, and a 2900 weight 8 at St Margaret's, which is still basically there with some recasting. Just a quick skip round some of the rings by Joseph Ayr. One that's a bit further away than you might expect is Merryworth in Kent, a mid-18th century classical church with a rather impressive porch, unusual sort of tower, the St Martin's in the Field type, has an Ayr 6 of 1746. Hemmingford Abbots, like Hemmingford Gray, has Ayr bells, but Hemmingford Gray are Thomas, Hemmingford Abbots were a 5 by Joseph, 1754. Several smaller peals, Triplo is quite a good example. And one of Ayr's biggest jobs was the 8 at Hitchin, originally 2700 weight, of which some of the bells still survive in the present 12. Ayer's biggest bells, Joseph Ayer's biggest bells, were at St Neots and Hitchin, both about 2700 weight. After Ayr died, the succession was to Edward Arnold, as we've already mentioned. Arnold advertised in the Ipswich Journal and probably other papers, but this is one of the few advertisements that we've found so far, that he was the successor to Joseph Ayr, and he carries on all the several branches of bell founding, clock and watch making, and also makes weighing engines for carriages. So Arnold wasn't going to give up that side of the business. Interestingly, this advertisement doesn't mention clocks, but Arnold was very definitely a clockmaker too. What do we know about him? Well, he may have been a Quaker too. The name Arnold is quite common in St Neots, but there isn't a baptism or birth of an Edward. But he was born about 1744. What we do know from the Inland Revenue apprenticeship records is that he was apprenticed to Joseph Ayr, and Joseph Ayer's trade is given as bell founder on 20th of February 1758. Whether he started learning bell founding, but also worked on other things, we don't know. But whether or not he was a bell founder is quite important. A Francis Arnold of St Neots bricklayer was one of Ayer's executors and trustees, but so far as we know, he wasn't Ayer's father, Arnold's father. Edward was described in Ayer's will as a clockmaker, received a bequest of £300, and that's the higher end of the bequests in Joseph's will, because the nieces in Kettering got the same. There are indications that the succession was not without difficulties. Raven, in his book on Cambridgeshire bells, says Arnold knew nothing about his business, but engaged a good foreman, Islip Edmonds, who continued the St Neots foundry after Ayer's death. Edmonds, of course, had also been an apprentice to Ayr. Now, this is quite strange because Edmonds is quite a shadowy figure, but one way or another, I managed to find out a lot about him, and I think I've probably run him to ground in the end, finding out when he was born, when he died, and where he spent a lot of his life. After he left St Neots in around 1760, 63, 64, because he married in London in that year, he cast a number of bells on his own. including one for Melchbourne, 1764, his native village, it turns out, and a 1700 weight bell, the sixth at Wellingborough, Northamptonshire. All his bells have St Neots characteristics, obviously reflecting his training, and they are competently cast, and they've lasted well. So what do we know about him? He was born 1737, the 11th and youngest child of a local farmer, William Edmonds. This William had been churchwarden at Melchbourne when Eyre did the clock, and in 1755 William lost his watch and advertised for its return in the Northampton Mercury, and it was a watch that was made by Eyre. Islet's brothers were churchwardens there in 1764 when he recast the treble, which bears their names as churchwardens. Now, recent research has turned up the fact that that Edmonds married in 1763, and all his children were baptized in Holborn, St Andrews, and one at St Sepulchre's, and he had a Summer Street address according to the parish register. Now, there are these supposed connections with Arnold, and probably less likely, now we know a bit more about him, with John Bryant at Hertford. So the theory is that if you read what's been written before, that Edmonds came back to run the foundry when Eyre died, because Arnold knew nothing about bell founding, but he was, as we know, apprenticed as a bell founder. Edmonds then stayed for a while. How long, nobody knows. Did he go to Leicester with Arnold, which we're about to come to? Did he go on to work with Bryant? Really don't know. And so that's open. But there's a strange thing in 1771 when Isaac's brother made a bequest to him, provided he leaves his present habitation and goes and resides at St Neots within 12 months after my decease. Given what we know about Joseph and his supposed offences, I can't help wondering whether, in fact, Edmonds had been the victim of those, and that's why he left St Neots in the first place, went to London, and Brother Thomas was attempting a reconciliation and trying to get him back to closer to the family. He may have come back, we don't know. He may have worked for Arnold, but he certainly didn't end his days in St Neots or in Leicester. He died at the workhouse in Gray's Inn, and he was buried at Holborn in 1793, aged about 54. Clearly a talented man with a slight, rather unfortunate history, but he's had an important part to play in the role of St Neots Foundry. There's also the issue of Arnold and Osborne. Again, the old writers, Raven and lots of people have repeated him, talk of Osborne having been Arnold's foreman, possibly before Islip Edmonds came back. There's not a shred of evidence for either. But the St Neots and Downham founders obviously did work together. Thomas Osborne was born in 1741, died in 1806, and he was succeeded at Downham Market as a bell founder by William Dobson. He was the son of Richard Dobson of Downham, and he was admitted to property in Downham on his father's death in 1763, when he's described as a carpenter. So he's clearly a woodworker initially, carpenter, not a bell founder. He worked with Joseph Eyre on a job at Stow Bardolph in Norfolk in 1767. But the interesting thing is that whatever the relationship between Arnold and Osborne was, possibly not a family relations as has been suggested, he did work with Edward Arnold between 1773 and 1778. But the relationship suggests that it was Osborne who was the pupil, not Arnold. The bells are signed both ways. Some are called Arnold and Osborne, some are Osborne and Arnold. And at Outwell, we've got here on the left, there's both ways round in one tower. All the inscriptions say Osborne and Arnold of St Neots, but a lot of the newspaper reports talk about Osborne and Arnold bell founders and bell hangers at Downham. So where the bells are cast is not that clear, except the fact that some of them are recorded in the very old Loughborough records suggests to me that they were part of the St Neots work. This was just a limited partnership, limited in duration, 1773 to 1778, and all the bells with the joint signature are in Norfolk. Arnold signed on his own elsewhere. So a slightly weird arrangement. They did include the recast in the front four of the 10 at Aylsham in 1775. And from 1779, Osborne was very much on his own, and of course went on to be a very successful founder, casting a number of eights, and of course the 10 at then 10 at Bury St Edmunds. So what about Arnold himself? I find it very hard to believe that he knew nothing of bell founding, because he did in fact produce a number of extremely good bells. His major ring was Northampton St Giles, cast at St Neots, that is, in 1783, a 2400 weight 8. But some others include the 8 at Ely, in which he retained one old bell, a 6 at Somersham, a 6 at Kelmarsh, Northamptonshire, and a 5 at Madewell just down the road. And up in Derbyshire, and this was on Ludlam's recommendation, Ludlam recommended him over the London founders, right up in the north of Derbyshire near Chesterfield at Staveley. That's a particularly interesting one because we have accounts of how the bells were transported and also the speed with which the order was turned round. Ayre's work carried on under Arnold, and these are just some of the examples of things that he did. In the Bell Foundry Museum, we've got a bell metal mortar that he made for a Potton chemist in 1776, signed Arnold St Neots. This church clock we've already seen, but there it is again, 1789 at East Carlton. Chimes, a number of examples, Holbeach being probably the best and are still going. He also made and repaired handbells, including the set for the Cambridge Youths. The Cambridge Youths accounts actually include this entry for 1777. Where is it? Yeah, paid Mr. Arnold, handbells repaired. And Arnold was very big, even at this date, in weighing engines. There's a list here of just some of the ones that he did. I have researched the records of a number of turnpike trusts, and in looking for these, I'm sure there's a lot more work to be done to find out exactly what was produced at St Neots. I think we would find, even from the surviving records, that the number was very large indeed. Arnold, as I've already mentioned, did go bankrupt in 1779 to 80 and must have had to sell up. Quite why he moved to Leicester in 1784, we don't really know, but it's very obvious from a couple of newspaper reports of jobs that he did after he moved that he was very aware of the Watts connection. At Dingley in Northamptonshire, he kept a Watts bell as the tenor when he recast the other bells as the front four of the 5. And also the report of the new bells at Rothley, we'll see in just a sec, do mention that with some pride that they were the first bells cast in Leicester since the days of Hugh Watts. The Leicester ringers were clearly pleased with their new 8 at St Martin's, the cathedral, in 1781. And they'd also opened the ring at St Giles in 1783. By this stage, Arnold's keen supporter, the Reverend William Ludlam, was living in Leicester too, and he was buried at St Mary de Castro there. Anyway, he advertised that he'd erected a new foundry in the South Gates at Leicester, where he was carrying on making clocks, all the other things you can see here, machines for weighing carriages, engines for extinguishing fire. And the bottom says, the bell foundry business only will be continued at St Neots by the said Edward Arnold. In other words, Arnold was himself carrying on the foundry at St Neots, but a lot of his other work was moving to Leicester, where he also had a bell foundry. Must have involved a fair bit of capital, of course, and possibly that was why just within a few months there was a bit of a change of plan with this rather confusing message. Mr. Arnold informs his friends that Robert Taylor, his late apprentice, has taken his shop at St Neots and begs continuous their favours from him. But also he said that he, Arnold, continues carrying on the business of bell founding at St Neots. So what it looks like is that it's still Arnold's business, but Taylor is now very much in charge. By 1785, he's very much describing himself as of Leicester, brackets, late of St Neots. And by 1787, he was describing himself exclusively of Leicester. And Robert Taylor, we'll see shortly, from 1785 onwards, very much in charge at St Neots. Arnold's move to Leicester, well, as I just mentioned, he'd cast a ring of 8 for St Martin's, the cathedral, in 1781, and they became 10, and Arnold provided a new clock and chimes about around the same time. Before moving, he provided a 6 for Quorn, 1773, 1777, and his first job after moving to Leicester was the 5 for Rothley, still there. An interesting job he did soon after he moved was a chime of bells for Stapleford in Leicestershire. Now, bells hung dead for chiming was really quite rare at this stage. The only ones I've ever been aware of for certain are the Royal Exchange in London, a set of 8, and this 6 at Stapleford, an old 5 with an Arnold treble. The chiming machine you can see there, a very standard Arnold machine, like the Airs would have produced. But on one of the corner posts, it's got a brass plate giving the tunes that the machine played. And interestingly, we're harking back here to the antecedents of the Airs and so on, and the social contact. The 2 of the tunes are by W.F. Esquire. That's clearly William Fortree, Squire Fortree of Kings Norton. And the gig by T. Goodfellow, well, Thomas Goodfellow was Thomas Ayre's tuner, apparently. And there's also a Kettering minuet. So we've got Kettering music, pouring at Kettering Kings Norton music from the chimes at Stapleford. Arnold's later history, briefly, Robert Taylor took over at St Neots in 1785. Arnold carried on at Southgate, general casting bells, including a complete 8 for Hanley, Staffordshire, 1790, 6 for Great Bar, and quite a few other complete rings, making church clocks, chiming machines, and all those other things. In 1792, he embarked on a rather unusual venture and opened the first iron foundry in Leicester. But he became bankrupt in 1793 and was discharged the following year. Bankruptcy sort of disabled you temporarily if you're able to clear your debts. His last recorded bells were in 1798, and his last known bell hanging work was at Stamford St Mary's in 1802, when the bells that he installed were cast by Thomas Mears. 1802 was the last people had heard of him, and nobody really knew what happened to him. But by chance, I found this Norfolk newspaper in a bundle of Quarter Sessions records at Bedford, because it was a newspaper containing a report of a Bedford court case, and there happened to be this old newspaper in there. And it mentioned Edward Arnold, and I thought, could that possibly have been our Edward Arnold? Well, I'm now 99% sure that it is, because he turns up at a number of other addresses, making weighing machines, specializing in them, and he later died in Islington, 1831, aged 92. So I think that probably finishes off Edward Arnold and explains where he was for the last 30 years of his life. Briefly to the iron foundry, you'll mention that he's got a separate iron foundry. This is an 1804 map of Leicester. The blue spot is the iron foundry. The main churches are shown, the cathedral, St Mary's and St Margaret's, and the approximate site of the bell foundry in Southgate. So when he was running his iron foundry, he had both of them. And he's still carrying on with his full range of goods, including electrical conductors for defending churches, lots of other things. And there's another one where he mentions engines for mowing lawns. He carried on making bells and working with bells until 1802. And in 1795, he advertised in several newspapers that a report having been propagated that the bell founding business was declined at Leicester. He sought to put the record straight and talk about some of the jobs he'd been doing. One of the most important ones mentioned in this advertisement is the former 5 at Kinalton in Nottinghamshire, which until the 70s remained almost untouched in their original frame and fittings. They've been replaced by a very light ring, but the frame and fittings were salvaged and are still in the Bell Museum in Saundby Church in Nottinghamshire. Really quite a remarkable case of frame and fittings and bells, all of one date, surviving complete. The bells too have been recycled to other places. The church was new at the time, and there's the faculty plan showing the rather spindly brick tower, and it proved not safe enough for the bells, so they were seldom rung. There's some Arnold fittings, at St Mary's Stamford, 1789, when he rehung the 6. And in 1802, he augmented the bells to 8, anti-clockwise rope circle, and you can see how the frame was adjusted to accommodate 2 trebles in what had once been 1 pit, and to put 3 and 4 round in what had been another pit. But again, we've got surviving Arnold fittings, including these rather interesting pendulum sliders. If you can see, in the pit down here is a block that swings with a peg on it that the stay engages with. Now, Taylor, of course, enters the scene now, and it's worth just having a quick look at his rivals. There's Osborne, but from 1779, very firmly established at Downham Market, and succeeded by William Dobson, and cast, for example, the 8 at Godmanchester. Dobson cast the 4 at Southoe just after Taylor had left St Neots. And at Soham, you've got an 8 by Osborne, 1788. The trebles recast and augmented to 10 by John Bryant of Hertford in 1808. So some other very competent founders, they cast a lot of complete rings working in the area. You might have thought one of the big rivals would have been Whitechapel, because of course they were, by the mid 18th century, a very big firm indeed. They cast the 12 at Great St Mary, the 10 in 1722, and the 2 trebles in 1770. There's the foundry, which of course sadly closed in 2017 after a very long continuous history. And you can see from the list on the right, there are several versions of this, that they had cast a very large number of rings indeed. Interestingly, Eyre and the other East Anglian founders kept them quite well out of the Ely Guild territory. The only complete rings of any note in the area are the former 6 at Leverington, all now recast, and the incredibly interesting and bumpy 6 at Conington. What a place! Coming back to our friend Ludlam again for his last word on the subject. He really just did not like the great London founders. And he said that at Northampton, where both founders were employed in casting 2 peals, 1782, 1783, there's no comparison in the musical tone. He went on to say that Whitechapel will cast you bells at almost any price and at any time. They don't need your old bells to recast, and they will cast you leaden ones, if you please. In short, they're great traffickers, but no artists, but by what I ever heard or saw of them. And so it was found at Northampton. He wasn't very complimentary about ringers either. He said there were no judges of bells at all, because they are far too easily bribed with beer to give the founder a favourable verdict for poor bells. On to Robert Taylor, the successor at St Neots, 1785. So who was he? Well, he was the son of William Taylor, a grocer and draper at Risley in North Bedfordshire, and his wife Mary, and they were married at Colmworth in 1784. Taylor was apprenticed to Edward Arnold in 1775 when he's described as a whitesmith. Robert himself, having established his business and got going, was married in 1789 to Elizabeth Fowler. You'll find printed accounts that say that she was the daughter of William Fowler, the St Neots brewer. It was more likely a niece, and a relative who's done extensive work on the family tree has very recently told us that her father, she was the daughter of Edward Fowler of Aynsham in Oxfordshire. It's interesting that Taylor's in-laws, therefore, came from the Oxford area, and that's where Robert Taylor moved on to. Of their 6 children, 2 died in infancy, but William and John were to become eventual partners and successors in the business. There are a number of apprentices, none of them, Thomas Safford crops up in Cambridge, none of the others ever crop up in the world of clockmaking or bell founding. Now, Taylor was widowed in 1805, but did stay in St Neots. The 2 sons joined the business, William in 1817, John in 1821. And in 1821, Robert left St Neots and moved the foundry to Oxford. He traded as various names in the latter period through the 20s, as at Taylor and Sons, Robert Taylor and Sons, and as W and J Taylor, in other words, without father's name at all. Robert died in 1830 and is buried at St Ebbs in Oxford. Now, we have some information on the Taylor furnaces at St Neots. We don't know exactly when he moved, but Robert Taylor had foundries on 2 different sites: the Priory, where Arnold and Eyre had been, and in Cambridge Street. Arnold was certainly still at Eyre's Cone in 1780, and William Fowler bought that in 1789, but may have let Robert Taylor carry on. It's said that Fowler evicted Taylor, and there was bad blood between the Taylor and Fowler families. But the deeds show that Robert Taylor was still in occupation in 1814. But in that year, all the Fowler brewery interests, with the pubs, the brewery itself, and all the property were sold to John Day of Bedford. And Day certainly had a clear out, so if he hadn't already moved the foundry, it would have been in 1814 that he relocated. In the foundry records, there are plans of the two furnaces with a number of technical details. These were, of course, done from memory later. The left-hand one may be contemporary, but it's among many doodles in one of the very old books. The Cambridge Street one was certainly done from later. So where did they live and where did they work? In St Neots Marketplace, and if you look at the bottom middle photo, you've got Gatehouse Estate. That was the house that was identified in 1933 when the Taylors were working on a family booklet as the former home of Robert Taylor. Evidence for that I don't know, but that's what I think they were told. Similarly, an old man they met, who's aged 90 in 1933, told E.D. Taylor and Jack Fiddler, one of Taylor's staff, that this house in the middle at the top in Cambridge Street was where the foundry had been, because his father told him that he'd known the bells being turned upside down on the street and tapped before they were sent off outside that archway. It could be, but the archway actually belongs to the flat with the house next door, so at number 23. You can see the areas in which they're involved here. The blue spot marks the spot, and there's the archway on the plan. If you want to know roughly where it is, Liddell is just up the road. That's supposedly where the foundry was and where the Taylors lived before they moved to Oxford. The first Taylor bells were cast in 1785 to 6. The earliest one, 1785, wasn't known until just a couple of years ago, when it was offered to us at the Bell Foundry Museum in Loughborough, and obviously we snapped it up. It's very important as the first Taylor bell. But there is a reference to a bell dated 1785 as having been the ostler's bell at the King's Head Yard in St Neots. So just possibly that's that bell. The first ring that Robert Taylor cast was the back 5 of the now 6 at Bletsoe in Bedfordshire. And the fourth there has the actual date on it. The Robert Taylor and St Neots fake it, 4th of April, 1786. There's an interesting spin-off from the Bletsoe job where there'd been a 1400 weight 4 before the 5 were cast, in that in 1787, Taylor sold on the old Bletsoe tenor to Great Gransden in Huntingdonshire, where it still remains. The inscription was erased, but there's a note of the inscription of the old bell in the Oliver St John Cooper manuscripts at the British Library. And it turns out that enough of the wording can be read on the Great Gransden tenor to be absolutely sure that it was the old bell from Bletsoe. I wrote that up in the ringing world a very long time ago, if anyone wants to follow it up. Rather nicely for him, Taylor eventually got to cast some bells for his birthplace village at Risley. These were a Hugh Watts 5 of 1639, very late in Hugh Watts's day. And Taylor recast the tenor in 1814, and there's his name on the bell. He recast another bell in 1816 with John Bryant. It actually bears the name of both of them as founders, the only definite example of the two working together. Taylor's rehung the bells in 1891, and this is the cast iron plaque they put in the belfry commemorating the association with the village. Robert Taylor's work at St Neots includes these rings, starting with Bletsoe and going up to Swaff and Bulbeck, we'll arrive at in just a moment. A couple of points worth mentioning. Interesting that you'll note they're mainly 6s and 5s. There isn't an 8. The surviving archives of the St Neots business really do go back to the mid-18th century, and there's a page with the details for the settings for the 6 at Wollaston, 1806. The earlier records are quite scruffy, but there's a lot of information in there. Here you've got a card of Taylor and Son, bell founder St Neots, and this must be about 1818 because Robert Taylor has got his son William in partnership with him. It's after he was just Robert Taylor and before he became Robert Taylor and Sons. The activities that Taylor carried out were rather more limited than Eyre and Arnold. Bell founding, bell hanging, bell maintenance work, lots of documentary evidence, lots of cases, lots of bells. He's often described as a whitesmith. Most of those apprenticeship records call him a whitesmith, not a bell founder. And there's also a 1792 directory for St Neots where he's described as a whitesmith. But he was certainly doing other work like the upkeep of the parish fire engines at St Neots. And in 1808, it's documented that he provided a new set of chimes at Stamford. Good tower for St Neots people. Arnold and Taylor both got plenty of work in Stamford. The card we've got in the middle does mention that he repairs and makes church clocks and chimes. As I say, the range was clearly less extensive. Just a few early jobs. There's 2 6s in 1810, for example, Ramsey in Old Huntingdonshire and Eansbury just on the edge of St Neots. And there's the page from the records giving details of the Eansbury bells and the old 5 that they replaced. An interesting one, quite late in the St Neots days, was a small chiming bell that came to light a few years ago in the absolutely delightful thatched congregational chapel at Roxford, just over the Bedfordshire boundary. Just a couple of examples worth sharing with you. I'm grateful to Jeff Byrne for taking these photographs for me. I'd been up the tower at Croxton some years ago and remembered this rather squat frame. And I'm pretty sure it's a Taylor job because there was a record that the old frame at Melchbourne was also very, very low, and therefore the bells hung like right low down. Croxton certainly meets represents what I remember it being, and you'll see that the bell on the right is that the sill's cut out so that the bell can swing quite low into the base timbers of the frame. So I'd be pretty sure that frame is by Robert Taylor, and quite possibly 1804 when 2 of the bells were recast, and they're in the records. Just some of the fittings are also still of that date. There's a very typical St Neots style of hanging. And the 4th, for example, quite definitely has its original stock and ironwork, even if quite a lot of the other fittings have been replaced. Interesting 6, probably a surviving Robert Taylor job in some respects. Swaffham Bulbeck, right at the end of the St Neots period, no longer exists as a complete job. But before the bells were rehung in the 90s, I did go to record the existing installation, measure the frame, do drawings, take photographs and so on. And it was almost possibly a wheel replacement, some wheel replacement, as if Robert Taylor and his lads had just walked out the tower. Complete original fittings and frame, and a Taylor 6, again with an exact date, 8th of July 1820, and still saying St Neots. So the move came just after that. The move to Oxford, well, it's always said that they left St Neots because of a fire. Was there a fire? There's no really definite information come to light, but David Bushby, the St Neots historian, who I used to know very well in my Bedford days, and we carried on corresponding about the Ayres and the Arnolds and the Taylors. He found a reference in the churchwarden's accounts to beer at Taylor's fire, £1 3s, and it would have been from the position in the accounts in the early summer of 1819. Lesser fires involved less expenditure, more like 10s, 14s. So it implies, if this does relate to Taylor's in Cambridge Street, that the conflagration was quite a big one. Of course, what they would have had to put it out was fire engines like these, the ones that the Taylors and Ayre had made, the Taylors and Ayre had maintained, with hand-operated pumps and hoses, fairly small tanks. You're not going to get a lot of water in one of those, and lots of buckets. And most fires, they lost a few buckets because they got burnt or chucked into the flames and lost. Whatever the reason, it might have been more because they were running out of work in the area and saw opportunities in Oxford, or possibly the Cambridge Street premises that they may have been forced to move to were never really that satisfactory, so they weren't altogether sad to move on. And Oxford had been the home of Robert's in-laws. So they moved to St Ebbs in Oxford, and the first definite reference we have to it is this advertisement in January 1822. They're making bells, of course, and church clocks and chimes, but also fancy and smith's work, church and house bell hanging, weighing machines again, fire engines, lathes, cutting engines, smoke jacks, all those sort of things, and generally making metalwork. Robert Taylor died in 1830, and there is his memorial plaque in St Ebbs. But by the time he died, his sons were more or less in charge of the business. One of the interesting things about the advertisement that I just shown is that there is no mention of weighing engines during the St Neots years when the Taylors were there, nor of fire engines apart from minor maintenance. And what was clearly happening as they moved to Oxford was the mechanical side of the business was growing. Indeed, in 1826, they advertised that they'd closed their iron foundry. Like Edward Arnold, they'd opened an experimental iron foundry because of the increased volume of mechanical work and bell founding. The later history, very briefly. Here's an overview of the family tree, down from Robert Taylor through his sons William and John, you see here in sketches and doodles from the early records, down to Paul Lee Taylor, who was the last family member to run the business. Here they all are, a rose gallery. John with his brother William beneath, his son John William I, and it was John William I who built the present foundry at Loughborough. Now his sons John William II and Denny, Edmund Denison, carried on through the First World War and right up until the Second World War, when Paul on the bottom right took over. Denny lost 3 nephews in the war, including Arnold Bradley Taylor, who had been quite involved in the firm, and John William III, who was certainly seen in the foundry with munitions in 1916. Price Taylor, another of Paul Taylor's elder brothers, was involved in the firm, but died on a business trip in Canada in 1927. Paul was actually the youngest son of John William II by John's second wife. So he was very young compared with all the others. And he died in 1981, but there was no male successor to carry on the business. Taylor and Sons carried on in Oxford. I've told you about this one in advance. This is the thing about the decline of the iron founding business and the other machine, because of the considerable increase in the other branches of the trade. You've got them very definitely trading as W&J Taylor, but occasionally with Taylor and Son on bells. And so business is booming, business is growing, business is booming. William particularly on the mechanical side, and John on the bell founding side. John actually went off exploring in Devon and established a bell foundry at Buckland Brewer, working between there and Oxford in the 1820s to the 1830s, casting, as you can see from this trade list in the middle, quite a lot of bells for places in the West Country. William remained at Oxford all the time, particularly developing his skills in clockmaking, but also carrying on casting bells like the one at the bottom right, 1843. John was always looking for new business. He was onto the building of new churches, the rebuilding of churches, and, for example, cast a peal of 8 for Stoke-on-Trent in 1830. The move to Loughborough came in 1839 when there was a contract up for grabs for casting a new peal of 8 bells for All Saints Church, Loughborough Parish. The bells were cast in 1840, and one of the stipulations of the contract was that the bells should be cast in or near Loughborough. John, therefore, took a lease of an old Pickford's warehouse down the London Road at Southfields, and he established the foundry there and decided to stay after this job was finished. Because the railway was just coming, the canal was there, the transport links were good, and he found it conducive to business. So John Taylor, whose portrait is on the left, carried on working there until 1858, and John William II in the middle must have had plans for the rebuilding, which took place in 1859, and the start of the present foundry. And there is what is it as it appeared in 1870, including the old Bell Foundry house, the Taylor family home alongside. That's as far as I'm going to take you. The rest of the Loughborough story is a separate talk, and quite a big one. So that's my summary of Made in St Neots. 3 names: Joseph Eyre, Edward Arnold, Robert Taylor. Definitely not household names. They're certainly famed in the bell world and clock world and engineering world in their day. It's almost 200 years, or 200 years exactly, since the last bell was cast in the town, But the nice thing about bells is that sound of St Neots can still be heard across the shires. Sorry, I've taken longer than I promised, but that's my introduction to the St Neots Bell Foundry.
Great, thank you very much. Here we go. So please do enter any questions that you've got. There are a few there already, so yeah, we do have a little bit of time left for questions. Firstly, I'd like to go back and say we're very grateful to be joined by the current rector of St Neots, who's posted quite a few interesting comments as we went along. It confirms that Joseph Ayres charity does indeed still go. Current assets circa £250. So that's I don't know what the growth of the original £100 is looking like over the time period. And also notes that the George is now a closed department store, which is a bit sad. And a little bit of side knowledge there says bells for one town in a few years would Hodson at Durham also count, the Cathedral 8 and St Oswald's 6. Going on to sort of more questions, we've got a question in that says, are any of the weighing machines still in existence?
I'd love to find one, and I did at one stage research the weighing machines quite extensively, but I don't think so. It would be really super to find one, but I don't know of any.
Great, and attached to that was a short message saying excellent talk as usual. Thank you very much. We're also joined by people from Great Gransden, who slightly anticipated the announcement of the arrival of the bell from Bletsoe, and they posted details that in 1789 the church warden's account showed that they paid Taylor the residue for the running of the Great Bell. That's when the ISIT bell came to Gransden, and in 1757 paid Mr. Ayres his bill £29 1 shilling and 7 pence, possibly for work on the clock chimes, which are still going every 3 hours. There we are.
I mean, I did examine all the installation with Philip back in the 80s, and I think that machine is almost certainly an Ayre machine of 1757. But there's a lot of mythology surrounding it, unfortunately, and there are other theories. But there's a clockmaker from Wellingborough, Thomas Powers, who made a lot of chime barrels, and he certainly made one for Great Gransden. But I think probably what you've got now is a 1757 Ayre replacement. But it's always very difficult to be completely sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think. Oh, yeah. Philip says, "Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for that. That's good." So, I think, yeah. Again, just thank you very much for a fantastic talk. I love the phrase "to be lamed by a bell." And I think that's a very real danger for us as we start to think about returning to ringing. So hopefully you don't get too many correspondents writing in to say
the one I love though. I mean, it happens to apply to 18th century Whitechapel because the great traffickers but no artists. That is just such a wonderful put down.
So oh, there we go. Do you have any details of what the apprentices actually did whilst at the foundry? In particular, T. Stafford, who became a Cambridge Youth Freemason and bell founder in Cambridge.
Yeah, no, we're lucky to have any record of them being there at all. It's only through the Inland Revenue Apprenticeship records, which just is basically the records were compiled to keep a record of the tax that was paid on the apprenticeships. But no, I mean, obviously I know about Stafford, and that I did say when I was speaking that he was the one that we know of subsequently. Don't know anything about any of the others. But in a multifaceted business like the St Neots Foundry, you would expect people to have worked in several different departments, probably, and it wouldn't have been that heavily departmentalized, but plenty of opportunities to get lots of different experience.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to preface this by saying there's no such thing as a silly question. Penny says, thanks so much. In my ignorance, what is a whitesmith? Well, I think that's a very good question.
Oh God, I looked this up last time someone asked it and I forgot. I mean, it's basically someone who works in other metals than iron. I think that's probably the gist of it. Just try a dictionary, but it's something like that. Yeah. So you've got someone who's working in copper and non-ferrous materials.
Yeah, no, I think that's yeah, that's good. So yeah, I mean, we'll give a few moments for any final questions, but like I say, thank you. That's a really great review. Like I say, it's and as Chris said at the beginning, the talk will be available after the event on YouTube. It's on the Cambridge District Bell Ringers channel. So if there's anything you want to go back and have another look at, then you're very welcome to. I can't see any further questions coming in, so I think it just remains to say, yeah, thanks a lot. Any parting words or thoughts from you, Chris?
Well, I mean, really to say that, you know, this is research I've picked up and run with again after quite a long layoff, really. So if anybody does have anything they want to contribute, I'd be delighted to hear from them. Yes, contrary or new or whatever, you know.
Yeah, excellent. If anyone wants to get in contact with Chris but doesn't have contact details, please feel free to drop me a line. You've got my details in the confirmation message for this webinar, or you can reach me at education@cambridgeringing.info, and we can establish contact that way. Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you very much. I'll say good night.